make it snappy. So my presentation is about a microgrid cluster that exists right here in Chicago. It's about 5 miles away from us right now. I find that in presentations I kind of black out at the beginning and then I feel like I miss the most important part. And so I'm going to start with some fun facts. One is that Meredith Willson, who wrote The Music Man, one of the songs in that musical is Till There Was You, and the Beatles recorded that song in 1963. And after his death, Meredith Willson's widow told the New York Times that the estate of Meredith Willson made more money from the royalties from Till There Was You than the whole Broadway musical ever did. It was fascinating. And then one of the, for me, most famous parodies of The Music Man, which is, you might have guessed, one of my favorite movies, was on The Simpsons in the episode Marge versus the Monorail. And Conan O'Brien wrote that episode and is a huge fan of the musical. And when he was offered a part in a reprisal of the musical on Broadway, he had to turn it down for professional reasons, and he called it the hardest choice he'd ever had to make professionally, which I found hilarious. So back to the topic at hand, we're going to talk about microgrids. And this microgrid cluster that exists in Chicago that's really novel to the market. So a microgrid, Lisa did a great job explaining, I don't feel like I have to belabor this, but it's a self-sustaining energy system that occupies a defined area. So it could be, like, often it'll be on college campuses or hospitals, medical facilities. It can be in neighborhoods, but I will see it's a newer endeavor. And then usually they're using distributed energy sources, like, as Lisa alluded to, some of them use natural gas generators, but others use renewables, like very commonly solar. It seems like what I've seen a little less common would be wind, and then they'll often use electricity storage in the form of batteries, and some have electrical vehicle charging too. So IIT is a college here in Chicago. It goes from about 30th to 35th and between the Dan Ryan and Michigan Avenue, so it's on the near south side, what I would call the near south side. And they have a microgrid. They started getting it, they started planning it in 2008, and it was completed in 2013. And the big impetus for them implementing a microgrid is because they were having reliability issues with the grid, with power from the grid. So they were having 3 or more outages per year that were costing them $500,000 a year to address, in things like, what I thought was most interesting was lab outages, where they would lose whole experiments that they were doing at the university, and that was really costly for them. So they put in a microgrid, and something that I thought was neat about it is that they have what are called mini grids in here, and you can see really small, different colored loops, and in those in the mini grids within the microgrid, they are able to move power around within the microgrid. So it's really sustainable, and it's in a loop rather than a hub and spoke fashion. So they just are very reliably powered now at IIT. This newer one, one more point about this, is that this is a behind the grid microgrid, and so they are a non-utility operator of this grid. It's IIT's own microgrid. A new one that is a utility-sponsored microgrid, which is really novel, is in Bronzeville, and it is happening right now. They're just getting up to speed. They're doing tests as of like February 2022. And it was, to me, in the things that I read about it, it seemed like it's part of this community of the future, which is one of ComEd's goals, as well as, and please, any utility people correct me if I'm saying something wrong. They also, it seemed like, wanted to use it experimentally to see how they could adapt this throughout the country in different neighborhoods. So this is a neighborhood-specific microgrid, which is the first one in the country to exist, from what I found. And it operates similarly to IIT, where they're able to island, I'll get to the, I don't want to spoil it. So this is, I mean, you can see it on Google Maps, it's new, but it's neat. So they have battery storage, they have some renewables, they have natural gas generators, and this is the battery storage for the project. I'm just in Google Street View here. There's a bunch of batteries behind this wall, and they have a mural to beautify it a little bit. So I found it really challenging to find a summary of this information online anywhere, so I made one, and maybe this will exist on the internet somewhere. But you can see that they're pretty similar in size. They were very expensive. The Bronzeville one was about double what the IIT one was. They were both just anecdotally subsidized by the DOE. The DOE obviously has interest in the development of controllers and experimental things that are happening on these microgrids that are integrated with utilities. So now what they've done is they've made it so that not only can each of these individual microgrids island from the main grid, they can island together so that they can share resources with each other. So if there's a power failure on the main grid, they have their own resources, and I think they said they can run on renewables for like 4 hours or something, and they both have battery storage. So now they can talk to each other and help each other out. And not only help each other out, they can also, if it's cheaper, like in Lisa's presentation, if it's cheaper and economically beneficial for them, they can decide how they want to, like, do they want to go from the grid? Do they want to go from IIT or Bronzeville, vice versa? They can plan that way. A little, maybe because this one's a utility-sponsored one, a little less sticking it to the man than I would say, but from a shared perspective of the players here, they're able to share resources like we were talking about. And then also from the utilities interest, the microgrids themselves can help the grid out in the scenario of an outage because they have battery storage and their own islanding capability, but then that power can flow back up into the grid if they need it to. I read in a few articles that this was, particularly with the Bronzeville one, this was logistically very challenging because of complying with city regulations. I think, for example, the mural that's on that battery wall in Bronzeville, they had to make accommodations for beautification of the project, and they just made it seem like it was a lot more arduous to get through the red tape than they might have expected. And then also, like Lisa was saying, like figuring out how to price that electricity. And when you think about expanding that throughout the country, how complicated that can get with how much that moves around. And then from a technical standpoint, and this is what I read the DOE was particularly interested in, is getting the islanding and then synchronizing back with the grid to work properly with these utility microgrids. So getting that controller took a ton of work. It sounded like the Conrad folks, the engineers there, did all sorts of simulations and used real equipment and experimental scenarios, and it's really impressive that this is online and working and they got the kinks worked out.
Yeah.
From a broader implication standpoint, this is really kind of what Lisa talked all about, but it's the having the Bronzeville microgrid in place with a utility-sponsored project, I think increases the likelihood or the viability of renewables in a way that at times I have been skeptical about. If we're able to have renewables in smaller spaces, at the point of use with batteries, and it's in conjunction with the grid, it just seems like it makes me really optimistic, actually. Because then everyone wins. And there are places in the world already, like in Australia, where they're having, they're able to cut fossil fuel power gen completely out of that microgrid, so they're only operating on renewables with batteries and serving an entire community that they serve. That was incredible and more novel than you might think. And that's it. If you guys have any questions, it's 5:05, we'll see out of here.
Yeah, Emmy, just one point of clarification, not a question so much. Just I want to show the novel part about it really is that interconnection of the two microgrids, right? That's the piece that nobody's ever done that before. There's lots of community microgrids. It's just that particular piece where it interfaces with another microgrid, I believe, is the novel part about this particular.
Absolutely. What I read was that all that plus the neighborhood, having the microgrid that serves just a neighborhood, not a hospital system or a university, but certainly like right there are microgrids.
And then the second one is in that red tape piece that you talked about. One of the big hurdles, I think, in Illinois, and really the heartburn a lot of us felt here in Chicago specifically, is ComEd owning a piece of, quote, generation. And they were adamant that this was experimental. They wanted to test this out. The reason they're doing it is to get behind us all. We'll see. But I mean, you know, we'll see. But I do agree with you. The red tape was there on the city side. But certainly that first part of a utility actually generating electricity took about 4 years to get through that.
Right, right. Thank you so much for chiming in.
Thank you.